We're back to the debate hosted by Sean McDowell between Mike Licona and this guy named John West on whether the gospel writers used literary conventions of their day in recording the words of Jesus and events of the life of Jesus, which were non-historical and were recognized as such by the original authors, grammatical, literary conventions, I should say, literary conventions of the day, or whether they are all sort of like a newspaper account of the life and words of Jesus. Mike Licona is well known in this regard for having brought sort of the broader deliverances of biblical scholarship to the evangelical community and pointed out, hey, these things, you don't have to think of them all as literal historical events. So in this debate, for example, one of the things they talk about are the words of Jesus on the cross recorded in the Gospel of John. It is finished. Did Jesus, in fact, say it is finished? Or is that John's theological reworking of Jesus saying, into thy hands I commit my spirit, and relaying the theological import of his death on the cross? And Mike Licona is open to this idea that Jesus did not, in fact, say literally, it is finished on the cross, whereas John West believes if you question that Jesus actually said the words, it is finished, to telestai, then you are on a slippery slope to probably reject the resurrection of Jesus altogether. Another big one, and this is the one that's really historically significant for Mike Licona's own career. 15 years ago or so, he had published in his major critical work of scholarship on the historiography of the New Testament that in Matthew 27, Jesus made the where it describes the tombs. Hey, sorry, one of my younger dog is like scratching the piano or threatening to. Anyway, so back in Matthew 27, where it describes the tombs being emptied at the resurrection of Jesus, John West believes you have to believe that tombs actually were empty and multiple people were resurrected or revivified, came back to life. Maybe not with eternal resurrection bodies like Jesus, but they did come back to life and the tombs were emptied. And you have to believe that that happened historically, or you're on a slippery slope again to rejecting the resurrection of Jesus itself. And Mike Licona famously argued 15 years ago, well, no, that could be viewed as a literary trope to talk about an earth-shaking event. One example he would give is today you would say, well, 9/11 shook the earth. You don't literally mean 9/11 shook the earth, but that is a literary convention to talk about a very, very momentous event. And likewise, in the first century, to talk about the tombs being emptied for a Jewish audience would be a way of theologizing the resurrection of Jesus and talking about, or the death of Jesus, and talking about what a momentous event this was. And back when Mike Licona argued that 15 years ago, I think that was like one half of a page of his like 700-page book. Norman Geisler and Al Mohler, among others, went after him and ended up getting Mike Licona removed, terminated from his position with the Southern Baptist denomination. And I wrote an article defending Mike Licona in the Christian Post at that time. And Mike Licona reached out to me and thanked me for doing that. That's how I first got to know him a little bit. And that is a classic example of evangelicalism eating its own tail, where these fundamentalist bullies like Norman Geisler target certain people like Mike Licona, which want to have an open conversation, which is a sign of theological health and maturity. And then they have to be silenced. And so Norman Geisler made it his mission at that time to silence Mike Licona, Al Mohler as well. John West is doing something similar today by fear mongering as a non-scholar, a non-academic who doesn't have a background either in theology and systematic theology or clearly in biblical studies and textual criticism, taking aim at Mike Licona and fear mongering that he's introducing a slippery slope into the church and he's impacted by naturalistic, biblical, skeptical views, anti-supernaturalistic views. So that's kind of sort of the background to this debate. Mike Licona now is just in this section of the debate that we're going to watch. He has just talked for a minute and a half about his ideas are not really controversial for those who understand the field. And he says even J.I. Packer, he got to know in his last 2 years of life. And Packer was didn't have a problem with Mike Licona's views. And he said he even heard Packer speak at a conference and say, we don't know if there was a tree, a literal tree of life and a literal tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. And we don't know if Eve literally spoke to a serpent. And I I mean, part of me actually wants to chuckle when I hear that, because those are the things that fundamentalists or fundagelicals obsess about. Are you questioning whether there was a literal tree of life and whether Eve literally talked to the serpent? Because if you are questioning that, you're questioning the gospel itself in their minds. Because for them, the gospel is just equivalent to the most wooden literalistic reading of the entire narrative that you get from Genesis through to Revelation. If you question any of that as a literal reading, then you're questioning the very gospel. And Licona is pointing out that G.I. Packer was not a fundamentalist on these issues. And John West, you can just see him chomping at the bit, and he wants to get in there, and he's going to in just a moment. So now I'm gonna pick up the video at the point where Mike Licona talks about how despite the fact that people like J.I. Packer had no problem with evangelicals having a diverse range of views about whether there was a literal tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or whether the saints really did rise in Matthew 27, or whether Job really was a historical person. Nonetheless, John West wants to suggest that each one of those issues is a matter of a slippery slope towards skepticism. So let's take listen to how Mike Licona presents that, and then how John West provides a response.
But the problem I think we have, like with John, is he is saying if you don't believe these things are historical as he does, then you're really starting to go down the slippery slope. And there are problems with that.
John, go ahead.
Well, I would say you're already down the slippery slope once you're saying things that for 2,000 years were accepted by Christians as historical are not. I mean, really, I would just urge people to listen to the language here. Now we're actually comparing something that was in the New Testament to things in the Old Testament that he doesn't think were historical or factual. And so by adopting that very claim, you could pretty much make that same argument about everything supernatural in the New Testament. But let's talk about.
Okay, first of all, this is fundamentalists like this guy, John West, and they love to talk about what Christians have believed for 2,000 years, which is just false. As Mike Licona points out, at least since Origen, Augustine, in the patristic era, Christian academic scholars have raised various questions about understanding the historicity of various passages, stories, accounts within Scripture. And people like John West just ignore that diversity and talk without any justification about what all Christians have believed over 2,000 years. And there's sort of a classic no true Scotsman fallacy here, because then when you point out, oh yeah, but this Christian didn't, what, they weren't a true Christian then by John West's measure? So they just create a false sense of a unified tradition in order to buoy their claims or buttress their claims. Second thing is you can also point out to things that Christians have believed for hundreds of years, which in fact we should repudiate. So for example, Gushy, hold on a second, I'm just blanking on his first name. That was really weird. I think that I've just been in the weeds too much, so I'm actually forgetting basic things. David Gushy, well-known Christian ethicist, some of his central work was looking at the history of anti-Semitism in the Christian church. And up until 18th, 19th century, and into the 20th century, anti-Semitism was widespread in the church and was justified theologically in all sorts of ways. Really, the thing that changed that was the final solution, and that brought about, among other things, a recognition of the degree to which anti-Semitism had infected the church for centuries. So yeah, you can talk about what Christians have believed about the Jews and a special curse on the Jews for centuries, going back centuries. It doesn't mean that you should believe that today. tradition is important. It's not infallible. It can be flawed. So just blindly appealing to a particular tradition that you've cherry-picked, as John West does, is just not a defensible way to reason about these issues. But also, like John West, because he's clearly not a systematic theologian, and a professional theologian, like he hasn't thought through what are the essentials, what are the most important things for him. Again, if you question the historicity of whether there was a tree in the garden, you're going to question whether Jesus died on a tree 2,000 years ago. The logic is just doesn't follow. And then he just wants to, from that, he wants to fearmonger about people like Licona.
Specifically the
But
resurrection
we
of the
don't,
saints.
John. We don't.
But there's no in principle reason not to. That's my point. But let me get to
Yes, there is. You have to.
See, he loves to fearmonger. If you question one thing, there will be no in principle reason not to question something else. And as Licona points out, that indeed does not follow. There are principled reasons to question. I mean, just think about this. Are you saying that you can't? Sorry, my dog's scratching. Are you saying there's no, like, that if you question whether there was a literal tree in the garden whenever, or whether there was a garden, because you understand Genesis 2 is a distinct, and Genesis 3 are a distinct genre of literature, which is not the same as the gospel. So you could question one and not the other. But in John West's mind, no, if you question whether there was a tree in the garden or two trees in the garden, you need to question whether Jesus died on the cross, or you'd have no principled reason not to. And it's laughable, this kind of logic. But that's the kind of logic you get from a fundagelical.
Consider genre.
So let's get to the specifics. Let me be able to respond, if I might, on the resurrection of the other saints in Matthew 27. Now, it's interesting to me that he cites, portents that were seen at the time of, or purported to be seen at the time of Caesar's death and other things, is that because part of what seems to be going around is that, well, people actually seeing things in nature and then making a theological interpretation of that means that they must have invented it, that those things didn't really take place in nature. And that's a very anti-supernatural bias that actually comes straight out of the 19th century and before of the higher critics. And so this
is another game that fundamentalists like John West love to play, is that if you say maybe something wasn't miraculous, that must be because you have an anti-supernatural bias. Which, think about this for a moment. Imagine if the televangelist comes to your town, or the tent preacher or whatever, and he's lengthening limbs on the platform. And you raise an objection, hey, there's actually a non-supernatural explanation of what happened here. Does it automatically follow that you have an anti-supernatural bias because you believe there's a non-supernatural explanation? If your friend is praying for the divine will, and at the moment that they pray, God, should I do this? Give me a sign. Let's say that they see a meteorite flash across, or a meteor flash across the sky. And they say, oh, that's the sign that I ought, in fact, to do this. Now, if unbeknownst to them, there was, in fact, a meteor shower that evening, and you point that out and say, maybe that wasn't the divine will. Maybe that was just you happened to see one of the meteors from the meteor shower. And they say, well, you have an anti-supernatural bias. Really? I mean, sometimes the natural explanation is the perfectly serviceable one or the preferred one. Just because you offer a natural explanation for something doesn't mean you have a anti-supernatural bias. Yet for people like John West, they fearmonger by saying, oh, whenever you raise some concern or objection, it must be because to his supernatural explanation, it must be because you have an anti-supernatural bias. And note how he'll also appeal to 19th century biblical criticism with this classic genetic fallacy, as if somehow, even if something does relate to methods developed in the 19th century, that somehow that thereby discredits it, which of course does not follow.
This is actually a good example of why I raised what I do about Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, of sincere Christians who are in fact getting some of their underlying assumptions from these basically non-Christian points of view. But let's talk about, again, the resurrection of the saints. It's
So did you hear there? So he says, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, which of course in Stockholm Syndrome, what you end up doing is somebody, let's say, who is a captive ends up identifying with their captor. And in Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, Christians identify with, I guess, the methods of the world. So this is another fundamental mindset, a classic binary perspective between either you follow the true good insights of within your belief community, or you're being corrupted by accepting insights, truth claims, methods from outside your belief community. And if it's the latter, well, that's Stockholm syndrome, because obviously anything from outside your belief community is evil and bad, and it's like a captor who has taken you captive. That is classic indoctrinational fundamentalist thinking, that anything that comes from outside has to be bad. So if Mike Licona draws biblical critical methods from critical scholars, some of whom were not Christians, or at least not Christians according to John West, then that must be bad.
embedded in what I think even Mike would concede of is as a historical narrative. It actually makes not just, well, the stars are falling, specific claims about both an earthquake, about the temple, the curtain being rent, and that there were actual, people who were raised, and then they went out and people saw them. So, you can assert that, well, that is just apocalyptic special effects, but it's embedded in a historical narrative that really, if you were reading it, I think, the idea that Matthew would think that people didn't think this was true, well, then Matthew is pretty stupid, because
So here he's going on about Matthew 27. And he's saying, look, it can't just be the earth shook as an idiom, an expression of a momentous theological event, because Matthew includes all these details about the curtain in the temple being torn and people being seen walking around. And so obviously that's historical. Here's an example of why this is so stupid. And I'm sorry to say stupid, but it's stupid. In Joshua chapter 10, so there's a description about the battles between the Israelites and the Canaanites. And it clearly describes within the narrative that God made the sun stand still, and then the Israelites completed the battle. Plain as, pardon the pun, plain as day, that God made the sun stand still and lengthened the day. And people like John West would clearly say, if you question that God literally extended the day, I guess that must be because you have an anti-supernatural bias. But even a very conservative evangelical scholar like Paul Copan points out that this was a common idiom in the ancient Near East, that when there is a description of a battle, then the side who won the battle creates their triumphal narrative about the battle, and they attribute sometimes the victory not only to their deity fighting for them, but to their deity having lengthened the day so that they could complete and win victory in the battle. And that's what the Israelites were doing. Is in Joshua chapter 10, it describes Yahweh as lengthening the day to ensure the victory of the Israelites over their enemies. That does not require a literal belief that there was a day lengthened, but rather is simply the narrator using this literary motif. Someone like John West would come in and say, yeah, but it actually describes the day being lengthened, as if somehow that overrides the idea that it is, in fact, an idiom that should not be interpreted literally. And that's all he's doing here with Matthew 27. He's saying, yeah, but it actually describes the curtain being rent and people walking around and being seen, as if that overrides the point that Mike just made, which, of course, it doesn't.
we know this? Let's go back to the early church fathers. Let's go back to Irenaeus, who lived from 120 to 200. He actually references this, saying that the fact that when the Holy Soul of Christ descended, many souls ascended and were seen in their bodies, that is pretty clearly a reference to this. Tertullian writes even more.
Yeah, okay, so you can go on and quote multiple people from the second or third centuries who believed X or Y or Z. You can also quote patristics who had anti-Semitic things to say about Jews. It just doesn't follow that today we should believe anti-Semitic things about Jews. Okay, I'm going to skip now to the point where John West responds to Mike Licona, specifically on J.I. Packer. This was actually the thing I really wanted to talk about because it's interesting. Mike Licona says in his last few years of life, J.I. Packer became friends with Mike Licona and didn't have a problem with Mike's views on the story of the resurrection in Matthew 27 not being historical. And so John West is going to offer a response to that, which I think is very interesting, especially when Mike Licona then spills the tea on that whole affair. So let's take a look at that. Okay, now here's the point where West talks about Packer.
Because it wasn't received that way. And in fact, and just one other thing, since he mentions J.I. Packer, let's be clear. J.I. Packer is on record as rejecting Mike's approach. Let me quote. As a framer of the ICBI statement on biblical inerrancy, who once studied Greco-Roman literature at advanced level, I judge Mike Licona's view that because the Gospels are semi-biographical, details of their narratives may be regarded as legendary and factually erroneous to be both academically and theologically unsound. So I'm glad that he was friends with J.I. Packer, but J.I. Packer did not accept his view.
Where was that, John?
Let me,
Hold on. Where did he say that? Where's that quote from?
In a letter, but it's been published on the web at Defending Inerrancy, but a letter from May 8, 2014.
Mike, go ahead.
And that
Okay, so that's the point West made. Now listen to Mike Licona's response. I talk about spilling the tea. He's going to pull back the curtain and show the ugly underbelly of fundamentalism.
is true. He did write that. Now let me give you the rest of the story. When he wrote that, I called him and I said, Jim, he had told me to call him Jim. I called him and I said, Jim, why did you write that? And he said, Mike, Norm pressured me to write it. And when I was with him in person up in Canada, and you can check this out with Dan Wallace and Greg Minette, both of them were eyewitnesses to this. We're in the green room at lunch during the first day of the conference up there. And I said, Jim, I'd like to ask you about the raised saints thing. And he said, Mike, I owe you an apology. And I said, for what? He said, I got pressured by Norm to put out that statement. I didn't want to do it, but he kept after me to do it. Mike, I didn't even read that portion in your book. I just went on what Norm told me about it. And then I just issued that statement in order to get him off my back. Would you forgive me? And I said, absolutely. And so that's what happened in that story. So yeah, you can, by the way, this is the first time I've said that publicly. And Dan and Greg and myself agreed that we would not say anything about it until after Jim had passed on to be with the Lord, because we didn't want him to be in any conversation. He didn't want to be in any kind of debate with that kind of stuff. So
first thing that comes to mind here, I mean, this is big. So let's just get our minds around this. Say J.I. Packer is, according to Mike Licona, claiming that he was pressured by Norm Geisler to write a letter and post it publicly criticizing Licona's view, even though he doesn't actually disagree with that view, and he hadn't read the stuff that he was criticizing from Mike Licona. And Mike Licona, and then he apologized privately to him, but apparently Packer was, let's be honest, too much of a coward to retract it, and in fact too cowardly that he made it in the first place, the statement. And very bizarrely, Mike Licona agrees to keep this silent for the rest of J.I. Packer's life, for fear that Norm Geisler would learn about it and then go on and attack Piper further. I mean, first of all, if this is true, and let me just say, I don't think Mike Licona is fabricating this. I don't think he's making something up. I don't think he would lie. And he just pointed out, and he's going to reiterate that there were two eyewitnesses as well, including Dan Wallace. So I think this is a credible story on its face. But what an indictment of J.I. Packer, what an indictment of Norm Geisler, and what an indictment of the fundamental subculture or quasi-academic subculture generally, where you have people being forced to make public statements and then remain silent for fear of being attacked. I mean, what do you think Norm Geisler is going to do? Like tar and feather you? What can this mean old man do to you? It just shows how unhealthy that the idea of psychological safety. This is something I talk about in my new book, The Wideness of the Sea, which is just coming out in the next couple of weeks. Is that evangelicals, there are millions of evangelicals who are gay affirming and are terrified to share their views publicly because they're going to get attacked and they know they will get attacked. And one reason they know they will get attacked is because someone like Mike Licona is hounded by people like Norm Geisler because he questioned whether a pericope about saints rising from the dead in Jerusalem is historically true. And if you question whether Job happened or whether there was a literal two trees in the Garden of Eden, you will likewise be hounded by these heresy hunters and people like John West who are just chomping at the bit to get at you and call you a heretic. That completely eradicates psychological safety, and people keep their opinions to themselves. It is so dysfunctional, so unhealthy. A bit of a backstory I thought was kind of humorous about this is that so he says Packer admits that he never actually read that portion of Mike Licona's book that he was criticizing. When I was going to Regent College, I did my master's degree there when J.I. Packer was there, and Packer was famous or infamous, I don't know which you would want to say, for always giving endorsements to endless numbers of books. And another fellow student actually went up to Packer once and he asked, "Do you actually read all the books that you endorse?" And Packer was really offended at that, which I can understand. But now when you hear the story that he never actually read the portion of Mike Licona's book that he gave a non-endorsement to, kind of makes you wonder if he did actually read all the books that he was endorsing. Anyway, so this story is an indictment of Packer. It's an indictment of Geisler. It's an indictment of fundagelical subculture, academic subculture, or quasi-academic subculture generally. And it shows just how constricting that subculture is. You have to be constantly fearful and that you're going to get attacked by people like John West who are going to label you a heretic, and people like Norm Geisler that are going to try to get you fired, and people like J.I. Packer that are going to be pressured into issuing statements against you and then too cowardly to retract them. And now let's just hear how John West has to respond to that.
That's what happened there. Origen took the raised saints differently. He said when they rose, they went to heaven and went to the holy city there. And then, I mean, I'd be happy. I don't want to get this clogged up. I know Sean wants to move on. I've already addressed this stuff in my large book, or they can go to my website. Unfortunately, I have a new website and we don't have my old art.
Okay, so anyway, he's going to go on. And the thing I want us to appreciate here from Licona is that there's an exasperation here, which at least is twofold. For one thing, well, it's more than twofold, but a couple big things are at play here. First of all, is that he's not saying anything shocking within biblical scholarship. It's only shocking to people like John West. And second, there's a theological frustration here, I think, that from Licona, that people like West, again, everything is a major for him because everything is questioning supernaturalism and his fundagelical reading of the entire Bible. Whereas Licona, I would think, has a much better sense of what it is to keep the main thing. And the resurrection of Jesus is simply not the same as the resurrection of saints in Matthew 27. One can question the latter without questioning the former. Not so, however, for John West. Hey, I'm just going to play John West's response to the Packer anecdote before we wrap things up.
So, I mean, that's I guess an interesting story. It's hard to publicly argue against something when someone makes a public statement on the record and then someone says, "Well, the guy's dead and gone, and now I can tell you secretly what he actually said."
Ask Dan Wallace and Greg Minette.
Okay, but that's still so
they were there.
Who have the same views that you do. So.
Okay, there's one thing I'm sympathetic with in West here, and there's one thing I find despicable. The thing that I'm sympathetic with is a sense of frustration that Packer ostensibly would issue a public statement and yet have a different view privately. And also then that Licona and the other two individuals would keep a cone of silence about what Packer's views actually were until he had passed away. So that I can understand the frustration. What is despicable, in my view, is that West implies but doesn't say that Licona is lying, that this is a fabricated story. And then when Licona points out that there were two other eyewitnesses to what Packer said to him, then John West says, well, they share the same views you do. Not having the courage to say outright that they are also lying, but implying, planting the seed to say that all of these individuals who have anti-supernatural biases against John West's interpretation of the Bible are probably lying, suggesting that they're probably lying about this Packer story. What is woven into that is for people like John West, if you disagree with them theologically, it must be, in part at least, because you have a deficit of moral character. Somehow you are evil. And if you're evil, well, probably you'll lie to support your views. And so what he suggests here, but again, doesn't even have the courage to say directly to Licona, is that he believes Licona is lying about this Packer story, and that Licona's two friends are probably just lying as well because they don't share West's fundagelical or fundamentalist theology. That is such a toxic, despicable way of interacting with other people, especially other people that are ostensibly in the same evangelical camp as you. And that is one reason why evangelical academic subculture is so sick, so unhealthy, because it's constantly eating its own tail with people like West who are doing this purity test baloney and calling out people like Licona simply for having the courage and conviction to do academic scholarship and try to introduce it to the evangelical community.